Let's break it down so you get it right on the test because most of my students get this confused. Zoning codes, building codes, and deed restrictions. What the heck are the differences? What the hell are they? Zoning codes and building codes both fall under police power. These are government restrictions based in laws that restrict what a property owner can and can't do with their own property. And it sounds crazy because it's your property. You should be able to do whatever the heck you want, but that's not the case. If you remember, control, one of those sticks in the bundle of rights that says you control your property within the framework of the law. So, of course, there are going to be laws from all angles that are telling you what you can and can't do with your property. Building codes and zoning codes are two of those laws. We're also going to talk about deed restrictions because that can restrict what you can and can't do with your property, but that's a private restriction, meaning it wasn't the government, it was private between the buyer and the seller. So let's start with the public restrictions, the government controls of zoning and building codes, and what are the difference? Well, zoning codes talk about the use of the building, like what you can do inside the building. If it's residential, you can live there. If it's commercial, it's some kind of business. But zoning codes can actually tell you what type of business you can run inside of your own building. It sounds crazy, but if you think about it, the purpose of all of these laws is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. For example, if I'm in a residential area, my town might not want me to put a factory at the corner because it might not be safe. Maybe there's chemicals or lots of traffic coming in and out, and it's just not a kind of use that they want to mix together with residential. Maybe I want to open a bar, but it's near a school or a strip club or near a church. And they're like, nope, it doesn't match. It's not good. We don't want this. We want to separate the uses. Each municipality is going to have different zoning codes based on the feel and the flavor of the people who live in the municipality. If you go into the suburbs, you're going to see a lot of separated uses. You're going to see a zone that's residential, a zone that's commercial, a zone that's industrial, and they're going to be separated by these things called buffer zones, usually a street or a park or a swath of trees. That type of zoning is typical in a place where people want to live where they live, work where they work, shop where they shop. If you go into an urban neighborhood, you're going to see zoning that looks very different. You're going to see mixed uses. You walk down a city block and there's all different kinds of uses. There's residential, there's commercial, there's bars, there's locksmith, there's bakeries, there's all kinds of mixed things. And that's because of zoning. So remember that zoning is local to the municipality, and these are the rules that are going to determine what the use is. So you don't need to know the zoning code for the exam. You need to understand what zoning is. Zoning also restricts density. If you go into a place that's rural with farmland, you might have one property per 20 acres. You go into the city and you might have 40 properties on a block. So it's a lot denser in a city because you have more people living per square mile than you do in a rural area. That's zoning. Zoning sets the flavor and the density. It also can restrict inside a particular building, whether it can be, for example, single family or an apartment building or a 4-unit. Building codes, on the other hand, restrict how the actual building is built. So zoning tells you what type of building you can have, and then building codes tell you how you can build the building. So they talk about materials and electrical outlets and all the types of construction that needs to be done, again, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Each local area, each municipality is going to have their own building codes that they adhere to, and they're going to talk about what needs to be done. It's often going to involve inspections on building and making sure that you have the proper permits and a certificate of occupancy. So building codes and zoning codes are separate, yet they go hand in hand, and the purpose of both is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Now let's move on to deed restrictions because they are a completely different animal, yet they can also restrict what someone can do with their property. A deed restriction is a private agreement. It is an agreement between civilians, not the government.
If I sell you a property and I want to make sure that you never sell alcohol there because it's against my beliefs, I can put a deed restriction on that property that says no alcohol to be sold here. When I convey title to you, I convey the title to the property to you with that deed restriction. You know about it, you agree to it. In fact, you might spend less on the property because I've now restricted what you can do in the future, because deed restrictions last forever. So a deed restriction between private parties has a similar effect to zoning laws, except for you agreed to it. And then when you buy the property from me and you go to sell it to someone else in the future, that deed restriction runs with the land because it's literally on the deed. When someone breaks a zoning code or a building code, the city steps in and fines them or shuts them down because they're violating a law. When a deed restriction is violated, there's no law that's being broken. It's an agreement privately between citizens. So the way to respond to a violation of a deed restriction is to go to court and let the court handle it. Here's the thing. If I put a deed restriction on my property and I sell it to you, and then 20 years later you sell it to someone else, they then violate the deed restriction by selling alcohol, but I'm dead and I don't even know about it. So who's going to stop them? This is something to remember on deed restrictions, because if the neighbors don't know or someone doesn't know, no one's going to report it, no one's going to take it to court, and no one's going to stop it. Unlike the law, where there's law enforcement always out there checking. Zoning codes, building codes, and deed restrictions all limit a property owner's right to control their property. That stick in the bundle of rights, control, says the owner of a property has the right to control the use of the property within the framework of the law. There are 3 ways that we just talked about in this video that limit the property owner's right of control. Public restrictions are zoning and building codes. Private restrictions are deed restrictions. Deed restrictions run forever, and they are enforced in court. Public restrictions, like building codes and zoning, are laws, and they are enforced by law enforcement agencies. There are so many terms and definitions to learn for this real estate exam. I know it can be overwhelming. The first step is understanding them so that when you try to memorize them, you can remember them because they make sense in your brain. If you're still confused about these topics, you can watch more of my YouTube videos or jump into my Beat the Real Estate Exam Facebook group and ask questions, tag me, and I'll jump in and explain it to you. And you also need to memorize this stuff, which is why I created the study pack. It includes electronic flashcards with video and audio recordings, practice exams, and we're always adding more to it.